I got an email. I believe you're live. I'm just double checking. Yeah, you are live. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll call the meeting to order. We'll pick up agenda item number 1, private activity bond allocation for calendar year 2022. I'd like to invite Scott Baker from the Office of State Treasurer to present. Thank you, Scott.
So as you know, each state gets a volume cap private activity bond that they can issue. This year for 2022, it is $110 per capita with a small state minimum of $335,115,000. Vermont gets the minimum, which is probably 5 times the per capita amount that we would get. So we get a good allocation. At the January emergency board meeting, the board did an initial allocation of $40 million to the Vermont Economic Development Authority, $20 million to the Vermont Bond Bank, and the remaining contingency. The other 2 issuing authorities, VHFA and VSAC, didn't request any. They get what's left over at the end of the year because they are allowed to carry it forward. At the January meeting, you also granted the bond bank the approval to assign their allocation to any governmental unit that may need it. Shortly after the January meeting, a borrower came to VITA with a request for $60 million, which they had only been allocated $40 million, but working with Bond Council and Governor's Council, Bond Bank was able to transfer their $20 million to VITA. So they had the $60 million that they were able to get the project done, which was great. It's good that they're able to use it. As of this point right now, that $60 million has been used. So whatever's remaining is in contingency. The bond bank and VITA do not have anything remaining. So we've talked to the 4 issuing authorities, and the request for the July reallocation is to replenish the $40 million to VITA, the $20 million to the bond bank so that they have some in case any further projects come forward, and the remaining amount to contingency. And see, that will leave $215,115,000 in contingency. And at the end of the year, we will work with the authorities, and any unused amount, we'll recommend to the governor how to reallocate that. And so we propose a motion that the emergency board, per 32 VSA section 992B, that the emergency board delegate to the governor the power and authority to assign or reallocate after December 20th and before December 31st, 2022, any unused portion of Vermont's calendar year 22 private activity bond cap, including the contingency, among and between Vermont Housing Finance Agency, the Vermont Student Assistance Corporation, the Vermont Economic Development Authority, and the Vermont Municipal Bond Bank. Any calendar year 22 private activity bond allocations to other eligible recipients will require emergency board action. And the reason for the reallocation is that VHFA and VSAC can carry that forward for 3 years, so that the reason they don't request anything now is whatever issues they're doing, they're using cap from 3 years ago or 2 years ago, so that the state doesn't use anything. So that is our proposed motion.
Any questions for Scott?
I have I guess a need for clarification. You talked about replenishing because of the 60 million.
Yes.
But the motion talks about the governor's authority to reallocate. We don't have to, that replenishment is that subject to this motion or separate from that? It seems to be the power to assign after July 20th. So my question is, do we need to take action?
Yeah, okay, yeah. So we would recommend that you allocate the 40 million to Vita and the 20 million to bond bank, and then the separate motion. So,
So we need two motions or
yeah,
a revised motion in order to do that.
yeah, I
That's
think
what
that
I
would
just
probably be
wanted.
appropriate.
Okay. That's catch.
Yeah.
Well, so I would make the motion to do the reallocation, which I guess we should have a written motion before us that would do that reallocation to replenish.
Okay,
But I would like to have
Have it in writing first.
writing first.
Do we have any lawyers in the room?
I suspect within an hour it can happen,
Yeah.
or in half an hour.
Maybe we can come back.
Maybe we can come back and do it quickly. It's just a question of looking at it.
But it's
so we'd be proposing allocating $40 million to Vita, 20 million to the bond bank, and
The easiest thing probably is to rewrite this motion, so it has two parts.
Yeah, I'm not sure that the motion that I would offer is going to include the materials from item number 1 that were in the, which were in the packet. So I think that would encompass everything.
I'm guessing is that,
I think if we, so the motion that I would ask for would be a motion regarding the governor's authority to reallocate the 2022 private activity bond volume cap as proposed in the emergency board's meeting materials for item 1.
Yeah.
So I think that would cover everything because it's in the materials.
It's here.
Is that correct? Okay. that would work.
I'm looking at the proposed motion.
No, this will be a
Sorry,
different
no.
motion.
Yeah.
A different motion than what's proposed there.
And you're referring to this
Yes,
material.
and
Yeah.
this will be the material.
So he's incorporating this material in the, it's just a question of how it gets drafted, right?
Right.
And I think,
So
Yeah.
if we do it the way it's,
that's gone.
Right.
And then we incorporate this
incorporate that,
in the motion.
right, I believe that will cover it.
so,
Do we have that?
no, we don't have
I'm gonna
that.
read
Are you, can you make the motion?
I can,
Oh, you,
or
all
I can ask for the motion. I can read you what.
right, and, all right, you can ask for it and I'll give it to you.
If you so choose.
The only question is, do we want to see it in writing before we vote it? And typically we do. I don't know that it would take anyone very long to actually
Could we
prepare
get-
it.
Do you want this?
Yes, if you could get
Four
copies.
I need you to.
Yeah.
All right.
And then we could put it to the-
Yeah, then we can vote happily and be done.
Questions for Scott while we're waiting for those copies?
I have a curiosity one. You indicated that a borrower came forward at requesting the 60 million. Is that an unusual?
that is pretty large. No, yes. So typically, the last several years, we've done, the 40 million and the 20 million. And I think Vita used $100,000 a couple of years ago. And generally, we haven't had any other requests, and most of it gets turned back at the end of the year. But so maybe not as far as loan, but a private activity bond loan.
I won't ask the thing that we're all thinking, which is wonder who it is, but that's not appropriate.
Yeah, so some of the uses can be, there's certain uses it can be for VHFA and VSAC use it because mortgage revenue bonds and student loan financing are typically the way they've been used, but they can also be used for solid waste facilities, that type of thing, airports.
I'm not asking who it is, but is that information typically confidential?
I think once the deal's done, it's probably.
Okay, that's what I was doing. We know everything.
You know what's going on.
So I think,
Time.
all right, you got it?
Are you comfortable with that, or do you want to move on to the next agenda and come back to this?
I'm comfortable with this after this discussion, so I would motion regarding the governor's authority to reallocate the 2022 private activity bond volume cap as proposed in the emergency board's meeting materials.
Is there a second? Motion's made, and seconded. Is there any discussion? All those in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? The ayes have it. Thank you very much, Scott. We'll now move on to agenda item number 2, the official state Medicaid report. I'd like to invite Nolan up from JFO to present the report.
Morning.
How are you?
Good. For the record, Nolan Langwell, Joint Fiscal Office. There are no motions this morning. As you know, the statute requires a year-end Medicaid report describing Medicaid-related expenditures and caseload. As I said, there are no motions on this today. The purpose of my testimony is to share a few of the highlights from the year-end report, which you have in the materials. The data in this report is the most current actual fiscal year 22 information we have today. As you know, this is the 3rd fiscal year that we've been contending with the public health emergency tied to COVID-19. Overall, Medicaid and Medicaid related expenditures were just shy of $2 billion. This is 2% or 40 million below what was budgeted in BAA, but still represents a 10% increase in fiscal year 21. Care came in almost 8 million below the budgeted amounts. As you know, this balance must remain in the Choices for Care program and cannot be used elsewhere. Waiver investments also came in below expenditures, which was mostly driven by the phase down and cap on investments for the INDs, or Institute for Mental Disease. This phase down will continue to be a state fiscal pressure as the investment room continues to decrease, and will continue to increase the state funding needs outside the waiver to make up for the loss of the federal match. 46 million of unexpended general fund on the AHS global commitment line are being carried forward into fiscal year 23. Much of this was generated by the 6.2% FMAP bump. Caseloads came in very close to estimates adopted by the E-Board last year, but there's 2 areas that are worth noting. One was the suspended redetermination impacts. The 3 non-disabled adult categories, which usually churn on and off the program, aren't churning. People are coming on to the program, but they're not being disenrolled if they're no longer meet eligibility requirements. And as you know, this is part of what's known as the maintenance of effort conditions in order to get that 6.2% FMAP bump. So as such, the enrollments will continue to increase while we continue to have this public health emergency. The other piece that's worth noting is the Vermont Prenatal Assistance Program. We anticipated a 5% increase in this group. However, caseload actually dropped by 20%, even though those in the cost-sharing reduction subsidies remain flat. This resulted in a $1.1 million reduction in gross spending. It's too soon to understand what is happening with that and why there's a disparity between those 2 programs. Again, we continue to get the 6.2% FMAP bump as long as the public health emergency is in place. This resulted in $88 million in general fund budget savings in fiscal year 22. We do know at this time that we will continue to have this at least through the December quarter of fiscal year 23, which will result in an estimated $45 million in budget savings, which will be addressed as part of the budget adjustment conversations. Looking ahead, as you all know, the global commitment waiver was recently renewed. It's effective July 1, 2022, and it goes through December 31st of 2027. The administration was able to negotiate some very favorable terms. I assume the governor has already been briefed on this, and the money chairs will hear more about this afternoon at Joint Fiscal Committee. So that's a brief high-level overview, and there's more details in this documents in your materials.
Questions for Nolan?
congratulations to AHS for what they did with the waiver. It was pretty remarkable.
Yeah, a lot of help from a lot of different people
Yeah.
coming together, and I thought it was favorable to Vermont.
Yeah, considering where we were to begin with, yeah.
Questions? Thank you, Noah. Move on to the main event, the official state revenue census forecast. Yeah, and present that. Morning.
Yeah. So this is one of the best bad forecasts that we've ever presented. And by that, I mean, we have in the largest fund that we project declines in both fiscal 2023 and 24 on a nominal dollar basis. And yet, compared to the January forecast on a current law basis, which includes considerable additional expenditures that were approved in the last session, across all three funds, about $150 million more than was forecast in January in fiscal 23, and about $40 million more in fiscal 24. So it's like almost all the economic statistics that we look at today, there's this confusing swirl of things are great, things are terrible, things are, what are they? And it's because there are two really strong cross currents that are occurring right now. And one of them is the tremendous demand and tremendous performance in terms of capacity to spend, of net worth that people have experienced. Household net worth, talk about that later, is just expanded extraordinarily through the pandemic. That enormous demand has created lots of benefits and lots of problems. One of the problems is that the supply can't meet that demand, and the result is inflation. And the response to inflation by the federal government is to reduce demand. There are a lot of different ways that can happen. You could raise taxes, that would immediately pull money out and reduce demand. Politically, that's much harder to do than nothing. Doing nothing lets inflation essentially reduce what you can buy for the same amount of money. And then there's monetary policy, and that is being used now as the primary mechanism to reduce demand. So interest rate increases are a fairly proven way to slow the economy, and that is the intent and purpose, and no ifs, ands, or buts. Until inflation drops, so until demand and supply are more closely aligned, interest rates are going to rise. And so that's creating a very unusual economic environment. Add to that a war in Europe that has strong inflationary implications in terms of energy prices, and energy and fertilizers is a big component, so it's affecting food prices as well as food exports from that region. You've got a tremendous amount of uncertainty going forward. This forecast is based on an assumption there will not be a all-out recession. About an hour and a half ago, the GDP numbers were released, and real GDP was negative in the second quarter, so that in the first quarter wasn't revised up. So you have 2 quarters of negative GDP. Some in the press will jump to calling that a recession. It's not how recessions are dated, and there's no way with the labor force as tight as it is, job growth at 372,000 in the last count, unemployment 3.6%, that we're in a recession now.
When was the last time that we were in a recession and anybody who wanted a job could get a job? So we're kind of hoping that the push and pull doesn't do something like this. But, you know, I look at the forecast, I want to jump in,
No.
as a full embrace of the effects of the extraordinary policy mix that we saw the first 2 years of the pandemic. And there's still quite a bit of capacity left in the system. We all know that there's ARPA funds that don't have to be spent until the end of federal fiscal year 26. We know that people's household savings rates are high. We know that corporations have a lot of free cash flow and their profitability levels are still reasonably high. And so our forecast really reflects those cross pressures that Tom laid out. And how the pick the superlative performance by our revenue system for all sorts of
Particularly
reasons,
income.
particularly the two income taxes. And, you know, we make a lot of noise about the large dollar numbers that are associated with the personal income tax. On a percentage basis, though, the corporate income tax was up much higher than the personal income tax.
On a seasonally adjusted annual basis, which is how we look at these data when we analyze them. They're never reported that way by tax or anybody else, but that's how we analyze the data. Corporate income tax in the fourth quarter was a $270 million on a seasonally adjusted annual rate. So it's just like, it literally, I would say about half the charts that we regularly look at, we've had to change the scales. Yeah. So anyway.
Well, I mean, you remember 2 years ago, we delayed the due date consistent with the feds from April to July. And then we got 2 Aprils in that fiscal year. We got an April and July. You know, some people did pay on time, and then we got another April the following year, and that was a gangbusters, off the charts positive thing. Well, this April, in the fourth quarter, we got within $250,000 of the year for the category that I count as paid returns and extension payments. We got, in that year that we had the 2 Aprils, we got $317.5 million in that category. This year, and we only had 1 April, it was $317.25 million. I had projected, because I do subcomponent projections, I had projected an all-time record over the previous year by about $20 million. It turned out to be $120 million. So we reflect that now, and that's part of the reason why you see negative numbers in the general fund forecast beyond 2023 in absolute dollar terms. Trying to dissect what part of that and what part of the corporate revenues are sustainable is still a work in process. And even though we have a lot of information about who paid and how much, we don't know a lot about some of the companies and some of the individuals that are paying substantial amounts of taxes to Vermont, what their circumstances is. So we don't know how much of that is temporary, maybe something that was a pandemic effect that's going to go away. And then I call it, I think we're going to have a post-pandemic new normal, but it's going to take a while for that that accumulated amount of reserve that's out there, either their household savings, free cash flow on the corporate balance sheet, and some of the public sector spending left to go that's been obligated and appropriated, but it hasn't been spent yet. And that's going to work its way through. And so I call that, and we've been having discussions amongst ourselves, and I've been having discussions with Commissioner Gresham about how it's like we have one foot on the accelerator and one part of what we're doing, and then we have the other foot on the brake. And the accelerator's starting to ease up a little bit, and the brake is starting to be pushed harder and harder. I mean, think about, we have a 1.5 percentage point increase in the Fed's rate in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Think of how harsh that is going to be for people who have variable rate mortgages and things of that nature. And we're using the Fed's policy tools, which a lot are demand side, to deal with a significant price pressure that has supply side characteristics on it as well. And the textbook in monetary policy says You don't take Fed tightening actions based on special factors or non-repeatable types of events, maybe like a war, okay? Or a hurricane, or, you know, those types of things, because you can tend to exaggerate them because there are lags between the time the Fed does this and the time that they bite. And in a certain situation where the Fed, I think, is fully committed, some would say because they're behind the curve, somewhat loud about how they're going to fight inflation. Okay. And I mean, the best thing, Tom and I joke about this, the best thing that could happen is that people that have savings don't spend it. Okay. The best thing about corporations' excess free cash flow is don't spend it. Okay. If you want to relieve, I mean, the good news is our rates are going up, the dollar's getting stronger. And so the things we import are going to be cheaper, and we're going to export some of our inflation to the rest of the world. But when you're in this kind of a situation, and when we say it's risky, it's not like the money that we've got is one-time money, but it's so vulnerable to a change in economic circumstances, that's part of the reason why we've almost made fiscal year 2024 be a fall fiscal year for everything that's happened in the previous 2.5, 3 years.
Senator Kitchell.
In past presentations, you've used the term unwinding in terms of how to really consider all the impacts, and you've laid out quite a few in terms of how it makes these fiscal forecasts difficult. And so I think at that point you were talking about 18 to 24 months would be that period of time where we would see all this coming together. And I guess what we're seeing is somewhat symptomatic of putting all that money into the system. You've used the term 10 billion for the state of Vermont. And so is that a period of time of that uncertainty and all these factors coming together overlaid by things that you never anticipated, like the war in Ukraine and impact on energy?
Yeah, I mean, it's never happened before.
Yeah.
So there's no template for saying, all right, what happened last time we put even 2 billion or 1 billion and just like dropped it in from complete deficit spending and then watch what happens. But you drop it in just for Vermont, 10 billion, and for the nation, something closer to 10 trillion, plus monetary policy that allowed a lot of leverage on that money. And so this is a giant experiment we're all living through. And that's why we say there's tremendous uncertainty. And it's not like the metrics we usually rely on as being pretty hard and fast. And we typically, in the models, we're relating these economic metrics to state revenues. And you get these pretty good relationships over time. And then all of a sudden they're not working. Well, why? Where did all that money come from? And then what's going to happen to it? How much gets saved? There's a table on page 7 on the document that I generated. I don't know if that got printed for everybody. Government. Yeah, okay, you do have that. That just shows. So we're looking at capacity, both balance sheets for corporations and households, as a way to sense like to what extent is there some capacity, and net worth is kind of the broadest measure of wealth. It's all the assets that households have minus all the liabilities, and the difference is net worth. But the top several lines are average net worth by household into 4 wealth percentile groups the Federal Reserve uses to report out these data. Now, just the fact that they're reported out as the top 1%, the next 9%, then the next 40, and the bottom 50 give you an idea of how unequal wealth distribution is in the nation. And it's also true with other metrics and things like that, but this is the fact. And actually a tremendous amount of consumer spending comes from not the top 1%, but upper income households. So, not to reinforce the idea that, well, the bottom 50 are the poorest. They're not. It's, there's within that a bottom 20 and a bottom 10, and it would be shocking probably to see some of those data, but and we see it through other mechanisms. But even if you look at it in this way, the average household net worth prior to the pandemic, 2020 Q1, the average household net worth for the bottom 50 was about $30,000. So after, you know, all the liabilities are taken off the balance sheet of $30,000. At the most recent reading, 2022 Q1, which is fairly current, it doubled to 60,000. Now that percent change actually was higher than the percent change for any other wealth percentile reported out, which is an indication that a lot of the pandemic money was targeted in a way that was, you know, designed to sort of help generally a lot of people, and sometimes especially lower end of the income and wealth spectrum. The next highest percent change, though, was in the top 1%. And there, the average household net worth is 24 million, just over 24 million change. And it grew to about 35 million. So household balance sheets there about $10.5 million larger. The next 9%, which is 91 to 99, went from 3.5 million to 4.5, is about $1 million gain. And then the next 40, 612 to 769. All of the wealth percentile groups had very substantial gains in net worth. And the composition of this is such that, you know, again, if you own a house, that's an asset that's going up in value. So you're, you know, if you own stocks and bonds and things, which again, in the top end, that's a big part of total net worth, those go up and those can go down. But over time, you know, if you look at two pages hence, the share of net worth by the top 1% and the share of the bottom 50%. The bottom 50% is the left axis in the black line. So that goes from, starts at about 3.5%. High point is about 4.3% in 1992. You can see how devastating the recession, the Great Recession was, where it dropped all the way down to less than 0.5% of the total net worth in the country was in the bottom 50% of the households. And that represented about $3,000 in total net worth. So that's how bad things can get, you know, at the bottom end. The top end, you get fluctuations. It's the scale on the right and the red line. And that shows it growing from about 23% of all total net worth in 1989, and now up closer to 32%. But both of those went up with the pandemic spending. You can see the last little blip there brings that up. But that's a lot of capacity that exists. When you look at cash and cash equivalents, which are you know, more the assets that are liquid and therefore could be turned quickly into demand, those are also really high.
So this is fascinating, and we haven't seen these charts, I think, in the past, but because we typically think of different groups in terms of income, not in terms of net worth. And I guess my question is not expecting an answer today, but it would be interesting to see this data correlated with income, because that's how we think of households. And you know, we have a general feeling that one's ability to pay is more closely related to income than to net worth, or at least property values. So
when we get,
just raising the question.
and when we get through the price pressures, it'll be interesting to see how this is after adjusting for price changes.
Yeah, but in isolation, I'll let this maybe think of the questions asked.
Yes, this raised a lot of questions, and the data we got from tax too, which is preliminary on tax year 2021, also showed sort of bottom and top having, you know, or lower percentiles doing, all of them went up.
In terms of income.
In terms of income, yeah. But that's preliminary, and we'll get more information on that. It's, you know, what we were trying to tease out is how much money's in the wings, because that's what's going against the ratcheting up of things. So take energy prices, for example, you know, and gas prices went through the roof. So it's all over the news. You see it every place you drive. You see these signs that say what the price is. So you know when it goes from, high $2 to $5, you can't miss it. It's really about 2.8% of all personal consumption expenditures is for transportation fuel. It's not like a gigantic item in the total budget. And actually, it went from an all-time low to about 2.8%, which is only a little bit over the last 10-year average in terms of total. So incomes have gone up faster. We've been spending less and less on fuel and on goods in general over time. And yeah, it's really expensive, but there's more capacity to pay for it. And that's what we're trying to get out of these data. To what extent is inflation going to cause people to really cut back? To what extent are higher interest rates really going to cause people to reduce demand? Because if it doesn't, then the rates are going to go higher and higher and higher until they do. I think it's pretty evident that there's commitment to do that. And that's where you get into more of a recession risk, a serious recession risk. And so that's why there's concern about it. And it's happening pretty fast.
Retail price of gas has come down about 10% since the.
And futures prices on gas are lower too, which creates some interesting T-fund movements because we get
Gas too.
yeah, we get an 8.8% increase in the total gasoline revenue in fiscal 23 because with all the floors and ceilings and triggers and everything on the motor fuel assessment tax, it actually in the prior 2 quarters when gas prices were super high, it clicked into that territory, and those are lagged into the application of revenue generation, such that the first 2 quarters of fiscal 23 for that particular component of the gas tax is likely to be high. Now, gallonage is flat or pretty dead in the water, but that will generate in the motor fuel assessment portion of that about a 13% increase for the whole year, which gives makes the T-fund in fiscal 23 look is unusually strong. That'll whiplash back down if prices actually go down as they're forecast to. But it wouldn't take much to have gas prices really spike. You could have a refinery knocked out by a hurricane, 1 refinery, or God forbid 2, even a 6 or 8 week period of no production, and you could see gas prices really soaring. So there's all kinds of vulnerability like that.
The industry estimate was that during the pandemic, that the industry retired about 1 million barrels a day of refining capacity in the United States. And so it's not necessarily the run up in the price of the raw material, the crude oil. It's been supply issues and processing capacity issues with the refining capacity, and it's become even more geographically specific to the Gulf Coast and places like that. It's extremely expensive to develop and bring these things and change them over and bring them back online and all those kinds of things. And so it's almost like, we use the opportunity for the pandemic and the decline in demand to retire some of the less efficient operations permanently. And the interesting thing is it's not adjusted for inflation, but in June 20th, we hit a little over $5 a gallon for the average retail price for gasoline. And you may remember, Representative Ansel, that back in mid-July of 2008, when we were shocked that it went over $4 a gallon. So that's what little things like the first ground war in Eastern Europe since World War II and those types of things do. And right now, the European economy is going through significant supply issues because they signed up with the antagonist on the other side of the war, and they don't hesitate to use energy supply as a quote unquote strategic tool.
Yeah, and while we're on the T-fund, motor vehicle purchase and use has been interesting. It was one of the few misses in a major consumption tax that should be benefiting from all this money. And of course, the reason for that is not that people weren't wanting to buy cars, but there weren't cars to buy. So the
chart of inventory issues.
Yeah,
I think Tom has it too.
I have a different version of it. I have a ratio, but either way you look at it.
And I also have a chart on the
inventories.
availability of housing units for sale in Vermont through the MLS system.
Thank
24, my report.
Yeah, so
That kind of shows you the supply issues and how that can, it's not necessarily that we don't have the economic fundamentals for the vehicle purchases, whether they're for direct acquisition vehicle or lease. And it's not a question that, there isn't, at least, there still is probably some capacity for non-debt purchases, cash purchases of housing units. But, you can see that the rapid increase in price and median price of a housing unit in Vermont is a direct reflection of the decrease in supply that economics probably is all too aware of. And, the fact that in June of 2022, there were 1,200 units available through the MLS, when if you go back just to, 17, 18, there were consistently over 5,000 units available. That gives you an indication of how the lack of supply is not only affecting the number of transactions, but has done a lot to boost the price. And I mean, a median housing price in Vermont of over $425,000. I mean, I've been doing this a long time, over 30 years, and I thought it was going to take us longer to get there than it actually turned out to be. And the other interesting thing on the gas tax, if you look at the misses relative to forecasts in 2022, we only missed by $500,000 in the gas tax forecast. And that's a forecast that's over 70 million. We missed by $500,000 in diesel, and that's only 17.5 million. So that gives you an indication of the importance of the price part of the gasoline.
Yeah, you look at the tip revenues, that's, the price tip gas is through the roof,
So I have sort of just a general question. I think I've been listening to the two of you do this for a really long time in various roles, and I know you have tons of years of experience at this. Are things more uncertain now than you've seen them before? So sort of where are we in terms of the last 20 years or 30 years or whatever?
Yeah, there's no question
Years
that no question that they're more uncertain, because this pandemic was this completely unique event. So in terms of how it affected stats and data and things that we look at to gauge, well, what's that going to mean to this company, or what's that going to mean to this government, and what's going to mean to, all the people we interact with. And that was, a completely unique event that had never occurred. Then the governmental, public sector response to that at the federal level was absolutely, just again, a completely different thing. And no sense of like, well, what's the timing in terms of when it hits the street, and how many people are going to save it, how many people are going to spend it, and what will it mean in terms of actual economic output? There was nothing in historical data that we could look at that would give us an indication of that. So it is, in all the years we've been doing this, at least for me, it is, there are wrinkles here and there are shocks and there are things like that. But this is really spinning things around. I have to say, it makes it very interesting just from a wonky analytic point of view, because you really understand systems a lot better when they're stressed in this way. Or I said we're living in the middle of a big experiment, but it's because of that we're understanding parts of the economy in different ways too. But it's been a great deal more work to go through the data and try to understand it and really make sense of what it's saying. And that's why I think you get sometimes some disparate sort of forecasts for these things. You look at motor vehicle purchase and use, which you were talking about, so it's supply constrained. That's a rare kind of occurrence, that when there's a lot of money out there and then it can't respond. And the semiconductor shortage, initially was the big slow point. And then you look at how semiconductor hoarding was occurring, and also its uses in frivolous stuff like crypto mining. And I've got a piece on crypto we could talk about at some point if you want to. But aside from energy use, you also have demand for semiconductors, and say, well, what's more important? That there's some recreational game that's consuming a whole bunch of semiconductors, or people's capacity to drive to and from work and the like, and military applications and other, computational applications. But that's a rare occurrence. You have a supply driven, component to that. So now we're getting into the forecast and we're saying, well, is supply going to come back? There are indications that, there's a little bit of improvement, but then all of a sudden, the main manufacturers of vehicles, Japan, the United States, and Germany, are each facing totally different environments. In Germany, it turns out a lot of the parts for cars are sourced in Eastern Europe and Ukraine among them. And so they are going to be particularly stressed. In Japan, a lot of the component parts come from China, which has been locked down with zero COVID policies. So they're in a worse position. The United States is better off, the United States manufacturers, with a lot of components coming from Mexico and Canada. But so there'll be some improvement, but across the whole globe, because we're also dealing with a lot of imports, not going to be as quick. Then you get interest rate spikes on top of that, so car loans will be more expensive. I think that the income side will power through that for a while at least, but that's baked in the forecast. Over the whole 5-year period that we do this, there are only 2 years statutory, but we do, a 5-year projection. You have a lot of inflation also that then sort of gets layered over. So something that's an ad valorem tax like that is expressed in nominal dollars is going to have higher numbers even with the same volume. And we've seen that in purchase and use to date because the volumes have been lower, but because the prices have been so high, the revenues haven't been hit as hard as otherwise they would have been. And you'll get this like with things like fees, where if you don't raise a fee and you're relying on that to pay an expense that's going to be affected by inflation, you're not going to be able to afford that. There's some taxes that will go up and down as the things that they support go up and down, and others that don't. So all that'll be part of the mix in terms of how you look at taxes and where revenue's coming from and all the rest. The income tax brackets are indexed, so that would be just yeah, that's going to be really important because it's the CPI for a prior period. So next year, in this tax year, there will be, and there can be an over adjustment if inflation slows quite a bit. So that's another complicating factor in dealing with nominal dollar revenues, which is what we're.
And the Fed is reported to follow the PCE deflator, personal consumption expenditures deflator, which is a broader measure than the CPI for household spending.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, if you look at the difference, and I have actually a chart on my thing about the difference between the PCE deflator and the CPI, I think it's page 12 on the top. And we're getting the PCE deflator out tomorrow for June. But if you look, and I look, there's total PCE deflator, personal consumption expenditure, which is what the Fed uses to have its target of reportedly 2% increase for price stability. And then I pull energy and food prices out of it and look at just the core PCE and the core CPI. The PCE deflator, which is what the Fed follows for its price stability guideline, and the CPI haven't been this widely divergent since 40 years ago. So there's some concern in terms of the nuance of how the Fed is fighting inflation. If they're relying on the PCE and that's tracking lower than the CPI, and maybe that maintains itself for a longer period of time, but everybody else is tracking the CPI, and it's like you sit there, well, inflation adjusted dollars, I shouldn't feel too bad, but I don't know anybody that doesn't pay their bills in current dollars. They don't claim it inflation adjusted dollars. And I would put the representative, so to answer your question, I would put a time dimension on the risk issue. Remember the underlying momentum and the way people pay taxes, whether they're corporate income taxes or personal income taxes and some of the other taxes, because our estimating rules are pretty strict and there's a high penalty if you underestimate. There's a lot of underlying momentum. When you have a big April, there's a lot of underlying momentum in the quarterly estimated payments that companies and individuals make. And most taxpayers aren't all that sophisticated. They don't make their adjustments until they get through the year, do a test. And so the mid-January estimated payments for personals are usually the ones where you're going to see ups or downs. That's why That's why we always fight with the emergency report. Go later in January because we want to see what the fourth quarter estimates are. And since most people don't itemize anymore because the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act changes, we want to see what the estimated payments are because they say a lot about what's going to happen in April. So I would say that there's some near-term momentum, and part of the reason why there's a fairly significant, a large up in 2023 is because of the dynamics of how that pays, and so how people pay their taxes and companies pay their taxes, and so we're going to be very, very focused on next April as an example, because we could get caught there if people overestimate. So I would say that the risk in the near term is not probably as great as it is for the fourth quarter of 23 and 24. Because as we go through this transition away from the importance of the fiscal stimulus, from both fiscal stimulus and then the tightening of monetary policy, I think 6 to 9 months, there's a lot of underlying momentum that's already baked in. But once you get beyond that, I think the risks go higher. And of course, if all of a sudden something happens, say a state does something real serious with energy supplies to Europe and some of the other, and we actually do end up in a recession, then a broad-based recession is going to have fairly significant and very near-term effects on the revenue system. So we always have to watch for that. But I think underlying momentum for at least the first half and into the second half of 23 is probably less risky. But I made the mistake a couple of years ago. Say I've been doing this for 30 years. I've seen everything, and that was after the Great Recession. I thought after the Great Recession, then the second, third housing bubble that I lived through, I pretty much seen everything. I won't make that mistake again.
Further questions?
So it sounds like there may be another federal stimulus package. It's the news of yesterday that maybe there's another agreement that maybe we'll be releasing some more federal money. Any speculation if indeed that comes through in terms of its effect on what we're going to see here?
Yeah, it's too early to know. There are tax offsets with a lot of that. So that's different than deficit spending. And with a tax offset, you're pretty much neutral in terms of affecting demand, changes in demand. But anything that's not is just fuel on the fire. And so we'll have to look at that in more depth.
Well, that's how that's going to interplay with our tax system. We have a very progressive, tax system. So whenever, someone says to me, "Oh, we're going to make sure all those upper income pay their fair share," they do pay a lot in Vermont, and we've taken care to make sure that our system is very progressive. And I mean, I'm still amazed at how so few taxpayers on their income tax pay so much of our total income tax.
Right, but when you look at wealth and income distributions, you can certainly understand why too. I mean, there's capacity, so it's not like,
Well,
I mean, that is
I'm
the
not
way-
worried about their capacity. I'm worrying about losing that capacity to another lower or no tax state.
And volatility, yeah, right, yeah, so, right.
So if in fact something does materialize, we will begin to see the effects of that more in 24 than in 23.
I'd have to really study that to
You can't
know.
even
And
predict,
then
yeah.
it needs, so this is going to the House, right, for approval, right,
Senate,
so
the
it's not
House,
yet.
Yeah,
yeah.
we're a long way away.
Well, I think it looks pretty likely in some form of it, but it would, I mean, yeah, it's nothing we could integrate into this until we really looked at the pieces and saw the timing and all the rest. But anything that doesn't, part of the problem with some of that early money is it had these time constraints, and even, the last round, you have to spend it by this period of time, and it actually has to be, on the ground happening, and that really limits flexibility and getting the best price and all that kind of stuff. And if there are more flexible rules about it, it's probably going to be more efficiently spent and more effectively spent.
But I mean, everything aside, new legislation, I try not to look at legislation until at least the writing's a couple weeks old.
Yeah.
But yeah, this forecast is very much still a soft landing forecast. And so all that other stuff is intramural compared to if the economy heads south for whatever reason. If we have a general economic downturn, this will unwind a lot faster than it's going to do on its own. And even on its own, I'm not sure that we're going to be completely beyond the residual effects of some of this federal pandemic assistance that was deficit spend, even when we get out into the 25, 26, 27 period, because unless it's taken out of the system by some way, it's respent lots of times. And obviously the effect of it diminishes, okay? But when you consider what $10 billion is on a per person basis, I mean, I'm still walking around thinking, how did that happen?
So I'm hesitant to ask this question, but you said if we have an economic downturn, how and when are we going to know that?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because there is actually a definition of what a recession is in my report.
Well, yeah, but we would see it in employment metrics.
Yes.
We would also, I mean, I think that's where it would have to extend to really probably.
To make a
qualify.
difference.
Yeah, to really make a difference. When
we see anything like that with
Right.
the workforce challenges that we have, like low unemployment rate,
Right.
jobs open everywhere.
Yeah.
And all this ARPA money still in the system.
Right.
Ready to be spent somewhere. So
Right.
this isn't going to happen instantaneously. It's going to take.
Right, it's a big shift. Yeah, and as we were talking about before, the meeting, we used the unemployment rate as sort of a pretty good general measure of the extent to which an economy is working. It's providing jobs to the people who want to work, which allow them to make a living, pay their expenses, and that in some ways that's sort of a purpose of the economy. And what we were talking about was an article in the New York Times this morning that was very favorable towards the governor, because they were talking about the correlation between unemployment and popularity as a governor. And Vermont, of course, has had very low unemployment rates. It's the 5th lowest in the June report, consistently, among the lowest. And you can say, yeah, we wring our hands all the time. We don't have enough workers. The businesses need more. But if you were to, measure, well, what's the pain of not having enough workers to make a bit more profit and, all the rest versus people who are really out of jobs and they can't meet their payments and all the rest, you take the low unemployment rate.
And,
So
and employment and unemployment is a lagging indicator. It usually takes a little while to manifest itself from the change in the current conditions. And if you look at our post-World War II recessions, we've nationally never gotten out of one with lower than a 6.1% unemployment rate. So I think if we remain focused on and that was for the one that was the mildest one and the least impact on labor markets, the Great Recession was much worse than that. And certainly we went through a 2-month period where we never seen labor market conditions erode like they did at the onset of the pandemic. So if we wait for that, it's a preponderance of the evidence. And there's a definition that the NBR has used, and it calls for much broader impact on economic metrics and indicators than just output. And we can go through a period where we have negative changes in output, and we still add jobs. It erodes productivity, but that's what's kind of going on now. We've seen 6 months now worth of decline in output, but we've been adding 300-400 jobs a month at the same time.
you also have set of employers that have had trouble getting workers. And even when sales start to drop or there's stress, all the rest, I don't think they're going to be quick to lay off people. And there's about $4 trillion in cash and cash equivalents that corporations are holding. So we've got households with maybe $2.5 trillion, companies with about $4 trillion. So there's some buffer to that also. I think that's going to make that slow. The concern I have is that inflation is what the Fed's looking at. And some of that is demand related, but some of that is pandemic supply chain related. And high interest rates aren't going to help the supply chain part. So if they don't resolve themselves, like China has this zero COVID problem, well, they shut down. That's a big chunk of manufacturing stuff that goes all over the world. If that doesn't resolve itself, interest rate after interest rate isn't going to affect that. And so, that's the concern, is that, again, it's a policy tool that's used in one way, but this is such an unusual mix of things happening.
A perfect antidote. I mean, the other thing that we look at for recessions is inventory imbalances on the goods, on the good side of the equation. Usually when you get into inventory issues, you start to see price discounting. And we're actually starting to see that in Walmart and Target and some of the other. And the interesting thing is that there were some news reports that what happened in that situation is that both Target and Walmart tried to do their own end runs around supply chain issues, and they ended up overbuying the wrong goods when they went around the supply chain. And now they're talking about having to have price discounts because they got an inventory overhang. So
their own shipping channels and things like that.
So I thought that was just an interesting development outside the supply. And the supply chain is very complex.
And if you're a forecaster for one of those entities and trying to say, well, how much of what stuff do we need? And consumers are constantly changing things. There's a couple of charts on just that shift, goods to services, page 11 and 12. And you'll see, like, over a long period of time, the purchases of, the share of all consumer expenditures that go to goods, which is the red line, and all consumer expenditures that go to blue, which is which go to services, blue line. It's going down for goods, it's going up for services. Then all of a sudden, at the end of this, you get a 5 percentage point change in consumer. That's a seismic shift to be telling the economy all of a sudden we need a huge amount more goods and a huge amount less services. So all the people working in services, are nothing to do, and all of a sudden the goods side of it is all stressed, and the pandemic's in play. That's a super challenging thing for the economy to deal with, and it's not surprising that it takes a while for it to adjust and overshoot and all the rest.
Actually, couple that with supply and demand.
Yeah.
So typically prices elevate when there's less supply, more demand.
Right.
But people typically will say, well, I can live without that. I don't need to buy that at that point in time. I don't have the money to buy that. That's not the case.
You give them a lot of money, and then
a lot of money was injected into the economy to stimulate and overstimulate, right?
Yeah.
So
It was
people were
more.
willing to pay anything for this, so the prices kept going
Well,
up.
we'll find out what that anything is, and that's essentially what we're doing. And you're right. That's kind of what occurred. But it also brought the economy back incredibly quickly. So from this calamitous dive, we're back where you look at meals and rooms revenue. It's great. I looked at the 2020 January forecast for meals and rooms. We're 4.4% above that of fiscal 22 than we had projected prior to the pandemic. All right. So it's completely back and then some. And it's on a trajectory that's even steeper going up because there's more money and there's a lot of pent up demand for travel and tourism. And the airlines are so whacked out that people are happy to drive if they can, have a vacation to drive, and we benefit from that with all the big metro areas that are within driving distance. So go figure.
2 or 3 years ago, we didn't know at this point in time of the year, I can't remember which year it was, we didn't know if we were going to make it through.
Yeah.
We didn't know if we were going to make it through at all.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden we have a surplus.
Still all those revenue risk memos that I wrote weekly.
Well, without the federal intervention, it would have been a whole different story. But it's created a whole
Nowhere.
bunch of other stories.
44 years ago, when I was looking at graduate school, I would have found this an extremely target-rich environment for my.
You could have written several.
Yeah.
Yes,
Will be.
there are going to be, over the next 20 years, fascinating PhD dissertations and master's thesis written from all this stuff.
Fascinating for some.
Yes.
That time reading for others.
We'll have trouble
Yep. Indeed.
Are you looking for a motion
Well,
at this point?
if there are no more questions,
I would move the adoption of the revenue forecast, and I think it's item 3.
yeah, and this, maybe I'll read the motion just to make sure we have it right. A motion that the state revenue estimates for fiscal year 23 and fiscal year 24 are adopted as presented in item 3 of the emergency board's meeting materials.
So moved.
The second. Motion has been made and seconded. Is there any further discussion? All those in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, the ayes have it, and you have passed agenda item number 3. Thank you very much for your presentation. We'll now move on to agenda item number 4, the education fund outlook. And we'll have Julie and Catherine to present. And
Still morning. We're here to talk about the ed fund, and there's two pieces that we want to discuss. One is the impact on taxes and tax rates that passed in the budget. And the second is it's a bit of an unusual year because we have reserves, and Julie's going to walk through that. So there's sort of 2 big sections of it, I would say, and the overall ed fund is in fine shape. But I'll walk through the details.
Yeah, good morning, Julie Victor with Joint Fiscal Office for the record. So just starting with a big picture, I believe that you have the education fund outlook in front of you. But really Act 178 of 2022 set the property yield, the income yield, and the uniform non-homestead property tax rate. And you can see those in the top lines, D, E, and C. And these yields in the uniform rates correspond with an average bill change of a decrease across all 3 classes by approximately 3.5%. And I also just big picture want to note that while on average tax bills will decrease, there was an increase in locally voted education spending, as well as a decline in equalized pupils. So you can see that increase in the education spending here in line 10, and the decline in equalized pupils in line F. So that's sort of big picture what we're looking at here in terms of bill reduction. And then you might notice that the education fund outlook includes a few additional lines, and these are really to reflect this PCB reserve. So we see the allocation of some of the FY22 surplus for FY23 costs and the reserve of the 22 million for PCBs, which was created in Act 178. We also see the provision for potential additional FY22 undesignated funds for PCBs. So according to Act 178, Section B, if at the close of FY22, there were unreserved and undesignated funds, the first 10 million would remain unreserved and unallocated. The next 10 million would go to the PCB reserve, and then any remaining funds would remain unreserved and unallocated. So after updating the sources to reflect the actuals at the close of FY22, and after accounting for appropriations and designations of FY22 funds, at the close there remained 23 million undesignated and unreserved. So this means that the PCB reserve is filled to 32 million, and that 13 million remain unreserved at the close of FY22. So then for FY23, we've updated the non-property sources from the forecast, and you can see that there's an estimated 16.8 million that is left unreserved and unallocated for FY23.
question?
When you're talking about the impact of federal spending, was it 2 years ago, about this time, we were talking about $150 million deficit in the ed fund. And it's been quite another story because we put sales tax in here. We're bringing a lot in. We're a few months ahead.
Yes.
This is more complex than sometimes the Ed Fund outlook is, but we were dealing with some uncertainty and some different contingencies, particularly with PCB. So I appreciate the presentation and the work that went into doing all this. And I do want to note that we did reduce property taxes by an average of 3.5%, which is actually pretty remarkable.
Any further questions? Thank you very much. Now move on to agenda item number 5, which is under business.
I think
Virtually, yeah. Morning, Representative Emmons.
Good morning. Thank you for allowing me to come in on Zoom. I appreciate it.
So you're going to present on the Williston Public Safety Building?
Yes, you keep breaking up. I don't know if it's on my end or your end. I believe we're going to start with the Commissioner Fitch, and walk through their request. And then I will weigh in terms of the discussion we had in my committee and our ultimate approval.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank
Commissioner
you.
Fitch.
Good morning. For the record, my name is Jennifer Fitch, and I'm the Commissioner of Buildings and General Services. Pursuant to 29 VSEA 5020, BGS is officially requesting approval from the Emergency Board to transfer $3,405,000 from unexpended project funds from 108 Cherry project from years of 2020 and 2021. We're asking for this money because we have completed design and we're about to go into construction, and we are roughly $3.4 million short. This, as you just heard from the folks that were presenting earlier, is due to supply chain irregularities, workforce shortages, and inflationary pressures. Right now, we're seeing about a 25% increase in construction costs in general, and this would represent a 15% increase. So it's what we're seeing in the market.
Questions for Commissioner Fitch before we turn it over to Representative Emmons? Representative Emmons.
Yes, we were made aware of this back, I believe, the end of June by the commissioner. And both Senator Benning, the chair of the Institutions Committee in the Senate, and myself met with them and talked over some options. And we did settle in on the 3.4 million because we also wanted $1 million of contingency for the whole project. Prior to this, there is no contingency on this $24 million project. So we worked with BGS to put together this memo that you have in front of you, and we shared this with our committee members. And my committee is unanimous in supporting transferring this money of unexpended funds from previous capital bills for the 108 Cherry to the Williston. The reason it's coming before the E-Board is by statute, if you need to go into moving money beyond your current section of the capital budget in the current fiscal year, you can go to previous capital budgets for unexpended project dollars. But to move those monies, you need the approval of the E-Board to do that. So that's why this proposal is before you folks for this approval, because the money that's being proposed to be shifted from 108 Cherry to the Williston Police Barracks is coming from previous capital bills, and it's been unexpended monies. So our committee supports this, and I believe that the commissioners also had conversations with individual members of the Senate institutions committees as well, and I believe they're in support of this as well. So I hope this helps, and thank you.
Any questions for Representative Emmons? Further questions for Commissioner Fitch?
So you need a motion then to
Yeah.
authorize and transfer of 3.45,
I will,
3.405.
can I read the,
You may have a
Yeah,
suggestion.
oh, you may have a good
one written down?
yes, thank you.
A motion to give the Commissioner of Buildings, General Services authorization to transfer monies as presented in item 5A of the Emergency Board's meeting materials. A motion.
So moved.
And a second.
Seconded.
Any further discussion?
We do have we have proposed motions here that don't reference, and it's getting
They're just
kind of
written out.
confusing. They're written differently. In this one. Specific about the 108 Cherry Street parking garage project. And mentioning that there seems to be,
There has been right along.
Yeah, no.
We just have a different set. It's whatever. We like yours.
I think it amounts to the same thing, but we should.
Well, yours
we'll do-
references the materials.
We'll make
yeah.
sure that we reference the same motion in the future.
I said, I moved what he said.
Okay. Any further discussion? All those in favor? signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? The ayes have it, and the motion has been carried.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alice.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Any other business to discuss?
It's going to be a fun year figuring out how to draw all of these pieces together and serve Vermonters.
It's going to be a very interesting year.
You're not going to call it fun?
You know what,
Interesting is better.
you know what the curse is. May you be born in an interesting year.
Yeah.
And I know Representative Ansel and myself were talking previously about whether we have another accelerated meeting before the one in January. I think we'll play it by ear. If we don't see anything significant happening, which will be hard to believe, maybe we won't have one. But if we see that we need one, we should talk, and we can do that within a certain period of time, so we can set that up fairly quickly. And have that, it might be a good idea because it's so volatile, but let's see how the next month and a half goes.
Yeah, and although I won't get to do it, I do think that there could be some discussion about whether we should be reviewing the schedule and the timing of the revenue forecast generally. We had a conversation about that as well, but that's not something we need to do here. I just want to flag it as a subject for further exploration. The people other than me.
The people that will remain and who gets reelected. I think there are a lot of, you're talking about uncertainties, Governor. There's a number of them, but it does seem prudent in light of the comments I made and so many unknown variables that can influence us.
Again, we'll see what happens on the federal level. Their fiscal year ends and new legislation.
Yeah.
Okay, is there a motion to adjourn? Okay, all those in favor, signify by saying aye. All those opposed, the ayes have it. And we